And thank you for staying with us on PM Express. Indeed, today we're having a conversation about the ratings agencies and the impact of the assessment of our creditworthiness on this economy. The president has been on the campaign, indeed, in the last few months since the economic crisis started biting hard against the ratings agencies. He suggested that there's bias against Africa and against Ghana in particular. But is that a myth or is that a reality? I've assembled a team of experts, a former finance minister, an analyst of international markets based in the UK, and our own Thuy Champon, who will join me with some thoughts on this. But before we get into that, I would have to break the issues down for you with our own analysis of what we've been trying to assess. To answer the question whether it's a myth or reality, some fascinating findings indeed I'll present to you. Remember, PM Express is always brought to you by Cherry Tree Properties and Syntex Tanks. After this short break, when we return, I'll get into the analysis, and then we'll hear from our panelists. So we are talking about this very subject. This is very fundamental to economic survival. The ratings agencies' bias against Africa. Is it a myth or is it a reality? Why are we having this conversation? Because the president has been on a campaign raising hell about the conduct of the ratings agencies. And we're going to be having a conversation with Dr. Thuy Champon, who is an economist and a political risk analyst, who joins us via Zoom right now. Also joining us is a former finance minister, Seth Terkper, who himself also experienced quite a bit of the ratings agencies and the work that they've done, led to serious challenges for him as well. He's bringing his own expertise into this conversation. And then Mark Bohan, who is the senior credit research analyst with Red Intelligence. All of them joining me right now with insights into this. But let's get into why we are having this conversation. The president and the finance minister have been singing from the same hymn book on this. Listen to the president recently at the Afri-Exim Bank conversations in Accra.
As the AU champion for African financial institutions and leader of a country which recently had to deal with one of the most difficult periods in its post-independent history, difficulties which were exacerbated by the reckless behavior of rating agencies that engaged in pro-cyclical downgrades, shutting Ghana out of capital markets and turning a liquidity crisis into a solvency crisis.
So that is the president just recently, 2 weeks ago, complaining about the ratings agencies. And so we've been tracking. Is there any justification for this criticism? I want to go back all the way to 2017 when they first came into office, keeping them honest. Because the ratings agencies, they've not always been negative when it comes to our economy, right? In 2017, when the president came to the office, if you look at Fitch, for example, they started with a stable outlook. And then from then, it's been downhill, as you can see on your screen. And sometimes negative, sometimes even they can't even rate us. Because of how junk, our creditworthiness has become. That's what you see there. And so it's not always been the case. That's Fitch. Fitch is the worst of the lot. Except that when you come to Moody's, you see that they started in 2020 with a positive outlook for us. And the ratings then was pretty good. In fact, it was an upgrade at the time. And that's just before we saw the problem with COVID hitting in March of that particular year. And then from then, we've had a downhill as well. So it isn't the case that they have this persistently, constantly over time, running down our economy in terms of the ratings and giving us this creditworthiness that has become a challenge when we go out there to borrow. That's the case with Moody's. And then you come to S&P, tracking back from 2017, you see a story of a positive, and this at the time was actually an upgrade. And I remember when this came out at the time, the government issued a statement and they were happy because they had just come in on the back of the elections in 2016. They were happy with the ratings that they got at the time. It wasn't a downgrade, it was actually an upgrade. And then, of course, they remain positive stable in 2018, September, and then the negative ratings and assessment began to bite, and then the downgrades began, and it's got incrementally worse in the COVID years. And true, it's contributed to where we are today. But just to illustrate to you that it hasn't always been about downgrades. That there was a time under this government when the story was pretty positive when it came to the assessment from the ratings agencies. But what are they? What do? They are positioned right in the middle here, between the creditors and between governments. If I want to lend to the government as a creditor, I need to be sure that they can pay me back the money with the interest that I'm expecting. In other words, I need to be sure that this government is credit worthy. How do I do that? I'll go to any of the three big ratings agencies. There are many of them out there, but the three is what I've talked about. Moody's, the three big ones. I go to them and look at how they're rating that country, right? And that will determine how much premium I'm putting on it, how much risk I'm factoring into it, how much it's going to cost Ghana, for example. So they are very key. You can't do really without them. If you want to go out there and borrow, the creditors are looking at it. The governments also rely on that. That's what I've illustrated to you. At the beginning, 2017, when the ratings were positive, the government was happy because that meant they were going to get more money. And I'll show you the direct link between the ratings you get and how much money comes in over a period. And so this is what they do in simple terms. They are independent, they assess your creditworthiness, and they tell your creditors if they can trust you. It's simple. If you want to lend somebody money, you need to be sure that they can pay you back. And they will do the assessment and rate you. And that rating will determine whether they give you back money, people give you money, they lend to you or not. And for a country like Ghana, we really live on borrowed money. That's why they are so critical in the big scheme of things in our economy. And then you look at the impact that they've had on us. Because at the time when it was really good and the ratings were fantastic, if you look at the ministry's own assessment, they really applauded themselves. And the world really applauded us because we were the darling boys of this. We trailblazers as the first country in Africa to issue a zero coupon tranche as far as Eurobond is concerned. So this was really positive at a time when the ratings were really fantastic. But this, for me, is a key thing to look at. If you go to 2018, when the ratings were not that negative, in other words, was positive, the government then, when the ratings were good in 2018, said this about the ratings they got from the agencies, that the ratings rapidly improved due to stability reforms and strategies. So we're taking the credit for the positive ratings. And what was the direct result of this? The direct result of this was the 2 billion that came in, because you can go to the Euro market on the back of a great ratings and assessment by the ratings agencies, and then money comes in, 2 billion. This is 2018. If you go to 2019, the story is the same, positive. What did the government say about it? The government said the credit performance has improved with all, the CRAs, which obviously is the credit rating agencies, upgrading or affirming their performance. So again, government was happy. What was the direct result of this? The direct result of this was $3 billion coming in because we've gone to the international market and borrowed on the back of that positive rating. And the government was very happy with that. If you go to 2020, similar story. As I've illustrated before, again, positive comment was Moody upgrades, Outlook, S&P maintain rating. This wasn't bad. The government, again, was not unhappy at the time. What was the direct result? We got, in the end, 3 billion because people were they were okay to give us money because, this wasn't a downgrade. It was stable at the time. And so money came in at the time. But then the problem then began to creep in. At this time, we're beginning to now show signs of instability in terms of our ratings. And yet it was still okay because this is pre-COVID. Ghana's rating steady 2021 due to COVID-19 measures by government. And so they were now beginning to see COVID beginning to bite. And yet still, we got just over 3 billion from the market. But then this is the challenge then that begins to hit. 2022, 2023 is when the ratings agencies began to really bite and turn the screw on us. And what did we see? Negative. For the first time, after all the positive comments I showed you at the end, what does government say now? The ratings are reckless and not favorable to African economies. So you begin to see the story obviously emerging that, well, at the time it shoots, it was great, commentary was great. What happened as a result of this? Zero. We went to the market. We've been locked out completely from the market. This is the reality as of now. That's what the president is complaining, right? So can you say on the back of it that there's bias or there isn't bias? You can't say that for sure because, as I will illustrate shortly, there have been other research that shows that it has been less than objective. There is been subjectivity in the process. So the president isn't entirely wrong, except that when it had favored us and it had been positive, we've been happy about it. And now it obviously isn't as positive. I was talking about the UNDP. The UNDP showed us a very interesting picture of the cost of subjective ratings on economies in the sub of the Sahara, the African countries in the sub of the Sahara, and they were very clear of the cost. 74 billion cost to our economies, and you can see that in excess interest that we are paying of 28 billion because of these subjective ratings we are getting, and in foregoing funding that should have come in but won't come in because people look at the ratings and they're afraid to lend us money. They put that together around 74 billion. This is the UNDP putting the cost together. So there's rising cost of borrowing. They talk about decrease in the volume of new capital coming in. So the UNDP study really nails the point about the subjectivities that we find in the rating, and they quantify it, which is a real hard research by a credible institution that was done. So clearly there are problems there, right? And then there's this challenge called the Africa risk premium. And research have shown that we are around 2.5 billion is priced into the loans that the world give us because they see Africa as pretty risky area. So they are pricing the risk into it and costing us a bit more. Higher coupon rate is also there as part of that challenge of more than 2.1%. They won't charge that elsewhere, but they'll charge that on Africa. So these things are real as well. And the methodologies have also been questioned. Again, UNDP questioning that. Are too subjective? People, the ratings agencies have all these challenges with the oligopoly that they put out, overemphasis on short-term economic trends. They may even have conflict of interest there as bond issuers. They pay the ratings agencies. Of course, if they are paying the ratings agencies, the concern is that they may put out ratings that would favor and increase the cost of the money that we are beginning to borrow. This is according to the UNDP. So these are real challenges. But does this necessarily mean that they are biased? And this is a systematic attempt to keep us impoverished or create a scenario where the lenders can profit off the ratings because they will get a bit more, as we've seen the Africa risk premium, which has been talked about. There have been many suggestions as far as this is concerned, including setting up our own ratings agencies on the continent. Let me quickly bring in my panelists to give me their thoughts on this very quick subject. Dr. Tuechampo, I want to start with you. So this whole conversation we are having today, the president had obviously led it. Is this issue about bias a myth or a reality?
It's actually neither here nor there. And the reason is very simple, because I think that the whole idea of quote unquote reckless behavior on the part of the ratings agencies, it doesn't actually even exist. If there's any reckless behavior at all, it's actually on the part of our governments, because nobody is forcing us necessarily to go to the markets to borrow. So let me take my time to break things down just a little bit for the purposes of education. There are two studies that have actually come out in the last few months. You've quoted the UNDP one, but there's actually a much more important and fundamental study done by IMF economists only 2 weeks ago. And the title of the paper is called Sub-Saharan Africa's Risk Perception Premium in Search of the Missing Factors. So what they do is they take a lot of countries globally, 107 countries, including in Africa, and they run a number of models and simulations and try to distill and answer the question whether there is this quote unquote perceived bias. And two key things stand out from that. The first one is that, yes, it is true that African countries are paying more to access these capital markets than other comparator countries. But the reason for that, and this is really the most important part of that study, when you distill and you control for additional factors, such as the transparency of our budgeting processes, such as the role of the informal sector in our economies, the level of financial development, and the quality of our public institutions. Sometimes the data we're providing is not consistent. The information that is going to these agencies, there are gaps and all of that. When you put those additional checks in the model, and I want to quote here, their results, so this is from the IMF, shows that this excess premium that is estimated for sub-Saharan African countries vanishes when these structural factors are accounted for in their estimation, right? So it is very clear that there are issues that are driving the bond pricing, and it goes beyond just the financial and the economic factors. There are other country risk, specific political risk factors that are at play that we need to factor into the equation. And once you actually do that, it becomes a very simple equation to solve, because what the sovereign risk pricing is doing is basically answering two things: the ability to pay and the willingness to pay. And if you add these two things up in a number of the measures and the metrics, it becomes quite clear that this issue of bias doesn't even really arise in the first instance.
Mr. Setekwe, do you agree with that? You were once a finance minister. You also had to deal with the ratings agencies. You agree that the bias doesn't play up at all? Please unmute for me.
I'm sorry. Okay. Thank you very much. Yes, the one factor which, almost every minister will complain about is the political risk. And that is often has to do with the fact that there isn't one Africa. And so in our case, sometimes we said, look, we are supposed to be, a safe haven. As far as possible, our democracy has worked reasonably well. And so there's a certain bias which we have often complained about. But let me also state that we should be realistic sometimes in that assessment, because often we point to just that one factor. No country is rated. And in fact, the bonds that we issue are rated. Therefore, no country, no bond is rated based on only one factor. And that is why I agree with Prof, about we looking at our own fundamentals. Now, you showed the history. In fact, if you go back to 2003, when, we started rating, and remember this was also going into the HIPIC era before we did our first bond in 2007. We have always maintained a B class. So B positive, we went down to B, negative. And then if you extend that graph, you will see that it's only started dropping and we're in junk status. And mind you, yes, often we blame COVID for that exercise, but I'll come to that. But we also went through the aftermath of the global financial crisis. We went through the shortage of gas and others to the economy, for almost 2 years, or if not more. And then doing so and other. So I'm saying every government, since at least the Kufuor era that took us into the bond markets, have experienced one shock or the other. And if you look at, often when we face these shocks, we go to the fund for stability, for austerity, right? If you look at the flows that have come in, yes, nobody disputes that COVID is the severest. But we also got the most flows for COVID, 6 billion, including the IMF 1 billion, loan, SDR, so what did we do? And the most we have often got was below 1 billion. Even the last ECF was 1 billion. So I think that we need to also, look at these other factors. And let me give you some numbers. If you take the economy from 57% new business, of debt, and you are, plus contingency minus close to 100%. You saw the stellar performance. If you take a deficit of 6.3, It wasn't 8.3, 6.3, as the minister himself said in a recent statement issued by the Ministry of Finance. And you are hovering at times at 13, between 13 and 15. Sometimes whether you are counting bailout costs or you are not counting them, things in memos and the rest, that itself is a stellar performance. And if you look at the IMF program, we are supposed to attain the sustainability in some years, to come, between 55, and 60% or thereabouts. This was the range that we gauged for ourselves when we set up the sinking fund. But the fact is that you can't keep borrowing and not, repay. And remember that our first sovereign bond, which posed a lot of risk to us, we were paying on the interest. It wasn't until 2014, when we saw the looming redemption in 2017 that we set up the sinking fund. Yeah. And we used our own oil revenue to take off 550 million. And that is what stabilized the situation. Because we will definitely have come to
Mr. Tekpa, just to clarify, are you suggesting that the economic challenge we faced recently is largely or possibly only due to our own doing, not because of the ratings agencies' rating of us?
I began by saying, even as minister, we did complain about some, what we perceive to be, biases and not. That's why I was very careful to start with that. And you can go to other, you can leave the sovereign bond market and go to, other treatments, whether employment or others, and you will see a bias against Africa. There is a bias against Africa. I'm not running away from that fact.
Okay, stay with me. I want to drill down a bit more into the bias. When you say bias, what exactly is the bias? What are they biased against? Just because we are on this side of the equator, this side of the world, or because our economies there's a stereotyping of our economy? I'll drill down a bit more with you because you also complain. But let me bring in Mark quickly. Mark, do you agree with the assessment the former finance minister is making that, there is some bias in the way the ratings agencies generally deal with Africa? Sorry, Mark, please unmute for me. Okay, I can Mark, I can see you clearly, but I can't hear you.
Yeah, sorry.
I'm still muted, yes,
I'm unmuted now. I would clearly say that I think this is mostly a myth, that there is not a bias. I mean, you've had a range of different studies, mainly opposing what the UNDP claim in the study. I mean, I think that the one Theo took up is a very important, interesting study. I mean, that, just to clarify, that is the focus on the Eurobond pricing in the market compared to other peer countries. And I think it's worth keeping in mind that credit ratings is often a lagging indicator, that the market moves before the credit rating agencies do. So when there is a downgrade or an upgrade, for most of the time that's actually already priced into the Eurobond yields. So it doesn't actually have an impact on bond pricing. So I think that's one factor that the UNDP study does not take into account. And of course, what they do, these ratings, is to assess the probability of a negative credit event. So of course, I know the Ghanaian government was very critical of the downgrades you've had over the past 1 or 2 years.
Yeah.
But you had a negative credit event on both the external borrowing, the Eurobonds, borrowing last year. So you can't say that in hindsight, you can definitely not say that they were wrong in making these downgrades. I would argue that maybe they should have made these downgrades earlier, that that the ratings in 2020 maybe are too optimistic, if anything, because I think if you look at the fiscal figures, the borrowing patterns of the government, where Ghana was heading at the time, I would push against any claim that Zambia or Ghana were pushed into default because of COVID. I mean, these developments with excessive fiscal deficits and heavy external borrowing have been in place for close to a decade, if not even longer. And of course, if you spend more of your, I think the interest to government revenue has been the most important indicator, and that's been steadily rising. And in the sort of very positive, in the environment of low developed markets, interest rates as you had up in just some 2 years ago, the easiest solutions for government when your interest costs started to kind of crowd out other spending was to borrow more. But of course, that is a self-reinforcing spiral, which has been in place for a long time. So that's my view on this.
In other words, if we've experienced downgrades over the last 1 or 2 years, it's because it is a reflection of reality.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Mr. Tekpe, let me bring you back in. You made the point that when you were the finance minister, you also had to complain about bias. When you say that, what exactly were you complaining about? When you talked about bias, what precisely was the bias that you had spotted and you were complaining about? Mr. Tekpe, again, you are muted, please.
Yeah, I tried to be balanced in my presentation. I cited only one specific example, what I said often we would complain about, which is, political, bias. And I said, if you looked, our issue was that if you looked at the whole of Africa, we were more stable, and therefore there was some differentiation that could have. I said with some of the studies that have come out, I've read some of them, especially the recent fund one and the rest. But remember that I went on to performance. And I gave figures. And I said that despite this, what is perceived to be bias, so remember, Ghana has been in the B range. So something must be definitely wrong.
Yeah, I understand that bit. I just want to understand when a finance minister mentions bias, what are you referring to? Just so that we have clarity on what that word means in the context of ratings. Is it political risk?
Yes, that's the point.
When you say political risk, are you referring to the fact that there's a potential political instability?
I'm saying that there are many indices. So mind you, when I say political risk, it's not only with respect to bonds. When we borrow commercial loans and others, political risk is a factor for which we pay premium. And I'm saying that is often, for me, the main thing. But when it comes to what if you want to be if you want to perform and be in a B rated criteria, there are indices and you must work towards it. There is no bias there. If you want it to be investment grade, there are criteria and you must work towards it, right? Either you accept it and you are in the market. And it doesn't really matter whether it is an African market or not. And let me give you one specific example. What I'm saying. We talk about appraisal. With this zero coupon, which you cited, remember the zero coupon, it was a warning, right? Because, we gave up 150 out of 500 for 350 million. That was a hefty amount to forego. And the warnings, it was beginning to tell us. Then we went for our appraisal, and we had to pay the interest up front, right? We had to pay the interest up front, right? So it was like discounting. Even before you go, the interest, or before you even got the loan. And mind you, the point that, Mark made, we were making it for ourselves, right? From around about 2020, 2021, we started analyzing and saying that interest and compensation was taking away all of what? It was tax revenue. It was taking away total revenue. Just 2 items. And that meant that the remainder of your recurrent expenditure was dependent on loan. Let alone your capital expenditure and your amortization, assuming you covered interest. Interest is not, if you talk about debt service, it's principal but interest. So these are not biases which we should blame on anybody, because we ourselves, Theo was, very vocal on that. Has said it, and we analyzed it, and we went back and showed it. And by the way, if you take single spine and you take doom sum, these were the very risk. And we came out after Century and said clearly, which led to the negotiation with Labour. Single spine being what led to the budget overrun. And we gave a warning as a government that we were using up to 70% or so to pay, single spine arrears and which is arrears of wages, which is what led to, instead of borrowing to pay the arrears and the rest, we spread it over a period of time to be able to absorb it within, our own, because by then our debt ratios were going up. So I don't want us to even, over focus on the issue of bias, because we have had difficulties, ourselves. We've discussed it.
Yeah. I mean, so I guess
we shouldn't be blaming anybody for it. That's the point that I'm making.
Okay. And so you circle back to that point, and I think all of you have that in your submission, which is that focus on yourselves and don't blame anybody else. But however, Dr. Chue Champon, if that is the case, why then do we have something called the Africa Risk Premium, which has been estimated to cost us north of $2 billion annually? The fact that you even have that thing means that there is a setting, you're being treated differently from everybody else. Isn't that bias? Isn't that some subjective way of analyzing the thing that doesn't apply to the rest of the world?
No, that is not. And I mean, we need to do two things. We need to look at the methodologies that are used to derive this so-called Africa Risk Premium. And then we also need to look at the data that is going into that. Look, Mark and I work in the market. We advise a lot of clients, people who come to us on country risk and political risk and debt issuance issues, and we're dealing with these issues almost on a daily basis, to the point that even myself and Professor Bokpin are even doing some work around this same issue of bond pricing and whether there is any bias or not. It's very clear. The idea of a bias is a myth. It's not supported by any rigorous empirical modeling.
So why then do you have the Africa Risk Premium? Why don't we have that in? Why don't you have a European Risk Premium?
There's no European Risk Premium.
Why?
If you factor in additional variables in your model, the fact that your budget processes in many of our countries are not transparent, the fact that our public institutions and the data they're churning out is not sometimes it doesn't come out. The fact that you're consistently running your budget and running double current account and budget deficits year on year. If you look at your interest payment and all these rigidities in the budget, if you factor in all those additional parameters in any model, it is very clear, because what you're doing is you're assessing whether somebody is going to likely default on paying a loan that you've taken, right? And if I do a very detailed analysis, that is not really based on just one variable. So remember that the country risk, the sovereign risk, assessment, those ratings are only one parameter in the square or in the scheme of parameters that are used. You showed a Venn diagram where you've got government and the lenders, and then you put the country risk in there. That's what would have pertained pre-2008-9 financial crisis. Post-financial crisis, a lot of these companies and the people that actually give the money, the investors, do their own detailed analysis. They speak to people like us in the market. They speak to other people, source for additional information before arriving at how they price that bond. So I'm saying that if you really do a very detailed, objective analysis where you consider other factors that are not necessarily financial or economic, but try to quantify that political risk premium. It's not even to do with elections per se, but you're looking at your budgeting, like I said, you're looking at your public institutions, the data that you're generating. You would come to a conclusion that this idea of risk premium is a myth. It doesn't exist.
I mean, Mark, so nonetheless, you have two reports in the space of a few months, UNDP very credible, saying there is a bias, there is in fact a subjective assessment that is done by the ratings agency, and then they quantify that to be 74 billion costing the economies. And of course, you have the IMF report that says, in essence, it's down to a lot of the factors that you've put out. But surely the UNDP would have caught on to part of the problem, which is that there is subjectivities in the calculations and analysis that is done by the ratings agencies. The opaqueness of the process is something that was amply captured in the process, that we as African economies are being shortchanged in the process when we don't even know what real factors the Moody's, the S&Ps, the Fitches are using in rating us. And by the way, the UNDP makes the point. The investors are paying for this to be done. There is a real possibility, and this is the UNDP making the point, that there is bias in there because of who is paying them. Isn't that a factor that we can't discount?
Thank you. Let me clarify a few points. So I actually spoke to UNDP ahead of this report being released. So I've previously worked when I was employed at TO, where HS, where TO Ashlempong now works. I worked on these ratings. I mean, it was very much a very similar rating process. It was essentially copied from S&P and Moody's. So contrary to what you said, the rating process is very transparent. There is Moody's, Fitch, they all publish their sovereign rating methodology, which factors they use. So it's kind of, there is this very mechanical part of the model, exactly what is the data that goes in there. But then there is what they call the analyst overlay. There is a possibility for an analyst to make an adjustment in the score, essentially saying that I don't think this data actually adequately captures what is, and you have, say, undocumented remittance flows or informal cross-border trade that actually means that this score, this data is actually not showing an adequate picture. And when I spoke to UNDP, I took up the governance ratings, which as an example, and that's normally rating agencies, they use the world governance indicators of the World Bank as a renowned data set on the different monitors, on different indicators, if there are 6 different sub-indicators. And I look at these quite regularly, so I was analyzing last year's edition. This year's edition will be released in a couple of months. So last year's edition, you had a sharp deterioration in the scores of South Africa and Kenya, which I think did not make sense to me. I mean, you had a risk of sort of political stability, risk of violence in Kenya that did not correspond to real factors. And also in South Africa, you had I think was a rule of corruption, a very sharp deterioration, while the sort of general view is that governance has improved under Ramaphosa, even if, of course, there still are issues. So what I said is, this is the potential where the rated company or rated country, so it is actually the countries in question that pay for the ratings, that they can actually challenge the analysts and say, hey, this score, we don't think it actually reflects conditions on the ground. And, have you considered other factors? There's, for instance, the Mo Ibrahim governance indicators. You could push for, you could highlight that there has been improvement in this score. And I think there is some leeway to actually, if you make a convincing case to change the to actually have an impact on the rating score. And what I hear from some of these people working in rating agencies is that they feel that the ownership of African governments in these ratings, the kind of people they bring into the meetings, the amount of data, the amount of work they've done in the interactions with the rating agencies is weaker than other regions. I mean, you could argue that this is hearsay, but I think there is potential for African governments to actually have more input in this ratings. Lastly, I want to bring up an example of Benin, where they challenged an outlook change. I believe this was a negative outlook change by S&P that just said, where S&P announced that they were affirming the B+ rating for Benin, but that the authorities were challenging the outlook change. In the end, that outlook remained unstable. So that's an example of an African government that successfully took on the rating agencies and actually made them change their mind.
I mean, Seteko, what do you say to that? What do you say to that?
Well, I think we are making the same point in a sense. It's one thing saying that a factor is taken into account in the ratings. It's another thing saying that it is insignificant in coming to the conclusion when you consider other factors, as I've said, like our own, debt performance, our own deficit performance, as Theo said, current accounts, being at half a month and all those type of things. Yes, so we shouldn't therefore, as Africans, overplay the issue, of, everything being blamed. That's the point I'm making. And yes, I think Mark is right, as minister. Often the drafts, will be given to the government, and the government will review it and give its feedback. And we have often, especially on Outlook and other things, I think we are, it's because the topic is unbiased. That is why it's not balanced. The discussion appears to be that way. And often corrections will be made. Often the ratings agencies will stick to their grounds, and they will publish the results. And our governments come up with reaction. And I'm saying that, if we look at, for me, the most important thing for Ghana is not bias. And I made that clear. I'm saying that in as much as I said that there could be some bias, because we ourselves have been pointing, especially since the IMF in Article 4, 2019, made the correction, which we had been making, and lifted the deficit from 5.7, 4.9 or whatever, 5.3, 4.9 to 7.0%. That should have been a warning when it started adjusting the debt. And then other ratings agencies started adapting. These were things we were talking about internally, before it came. But Evans, by the way, what will be the rating for our own domestic bond market, which we started? Our bonds were housed in Bank of Ghana until 2015, when we adopted the book building approach. Right? So less than 10 years, a market, the government market, which was the largest and whatever, today is facing haircuts. What is the rating? Well, we don't have it domestically. It is a factor in our ratings. But go and ask the pensioners, go and ask the pension funds, those who are picketing and the rest, to rate that market today. And I'm saying that, therefore, the solution is not in saying we need an African market. We started creating one. And it was working, as far as I'm concerned, to the extent that we had non-residents, some of those who were buying our external bonds, coming to buy our domestic bonds. What is the state of that market today, facing haircuts and the rest? It should tell us that there is some difficulty with the way we run, our affairs, and not always blame it, on externals. So we have a domestic market. We started building a domestic market. That domestic market did not have government bonds. We put the government bonds as part of, the Mahama administration initiative to put the bonds, and they became tradable. And look at where they are today. Today, we can't even issue those domestic bonds. Has that got anything to do with ratings?
Well, that is a very interesting question. Nonetheless, the complaints remain. In fact, it has been suggested that a way to deal with this is to have an African-centered ratings agency set up by Africans for Africans. I'll take a quick break.
I hope we would ask I would ask the opinion of the pension funds and the pensioners.
Yeah, we'll do so. And that's my next question, whether that is a solution to any of the problems that have been mentioned before. But remember that PMS is always brought to you by Cherry Tree Properties. Desires are wishes. Beauty is a promise of happiness, but passion is everything. Now, thinking about buying a new home, talk to those who build with passion. Sloan Square, a new gated community development at Sakumono, developed by Cherry Tree Properties, is one of a kind, well-planned luxury you will never love to miss. In fact, it is one that you are never experienced before. You need to call them on 0553 662 366, 0553 662 366, developed by Cherry Tree Properties, a one-of-a-kind, well-planned luxury you've never experience. Sophistication and class is what you do. Also, you don't want to forget, in Ghana you need water, and if you want to store it, because a day will come when your pipes may not be flowing, you need to call Syntex Tank right now, because no matter your water needs, Syntex Tank has it all. Syntex Tank is first to introduce double layer tank, and now you can have as many layers as you want. Syntex Tank is first to introduce white inner layer tanks in Ghana. We now introduce you to the customer specs order, which lets you order any color and size of preferences. Syntex Tank gives you the longest warranty of 7 years, which no other tank gives you in Ghana. So whatever your water consumption, size of project or demand, choose Syntex Tank. We have agents nationwide, so you won't miss us anywhere you are in this country. 0244 335 168, 0244 335 168. You can call them on that or shop online at syntexgh.com. Syntex Tanks, are strong, are tough. And I need just to quickly wrap up. And so I need to ask very quickly, Dr. Tuya Champon, should we have an African-centered ratings agency for us, by us?
Oh, of course. I mean, why not? But it's going to take some time to get that, process going, and the ratings that they do fully sort of accepted by other players in the market. But the point is, even if you had an African ratings agency, what methodology would they be using to arrive at that assessment? There will still be a mechanistic side to the process where you're looking at some economic and financial indicators, and there would also be, the analyst view, on top of that, and looking at other indicators. So whether we have an African ratings agency or not, it does not necessarily imply that you're going to get, a lower credit risk score and thereby get cheaper borrowings. It's the data and the evidence that should lead us to arrive at that conclusion. But yes, for sure, having an African agency, I mean, why not? It's really, for me, the substance of what the agency will be doing and the assessment and the methodology that would really play the big role in all of this.
Mark, do you agree?
Yes. Well, I mean, there are in fact two rating agencies that have been based out of Africa. There's GCR Ratings, which was based out of South Africa, that's now part of Moody's. And there's Bloomfield Ratings, which is based out of Cote d'Ivoire. And Bloomfield in particular have given significantly higher ratings to African entities than the other rating agencies.
There you have it. There you have it. That's the solution.
Yeah, but I mean, as a rating agency, essentially your credibility is everything. So, of course, if you're handing out AAA ratings to everyone, including entities that are a very high risk and that later on end up in negative credit events, then what is the point of having such an agency if it can't establish the credibility? And I mean, if you had African credit agency a few years ago that given AAA ratings to Ghana, Zambia, etc., what would be the point of it? Is my counter question.
Okay, Mark, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tekwe, as well, former finance minister, and Dr. Tuya Champon. Always a delight hearing your thoughts on these matters. Remember, PMS is always brought to you by Syntex Tank LPM, Syntex Tank, and also brought to you by Cherry Tree Properties. Enjoy the rest of your